Yeah, so I'm situated in Stockholm, here at the Danderyd University Hospital, that is part of KI, and I have been working with AI since 2014. Um, so first of all, why do we need AI in healthcare? I think it's a good thing to remember that we haven't had AI in healthcare, but despite that, we've reduced the mortality in myocardial infarctions by half. We have doubled the life expectancy with cancer. We do twice as many hip and knee arthroplasties in one day as we did back than in 20, 30 years back. So this means that we have done a lot of good. We're much more efficient. We are much better at treating patients and reaching good outcomes. But we also have a increasing number of elderly in our population. As they survive one disease, they're usually at the risk of another disease, and we have more or less a uh, pyramid turned upside down regarding population in most countries. I think most countries have a birth rate below 2 nowadays. So this is not getting any better. And the challenge is, of course, that healthcare is incredibly expensive. If you have a hospital bed, that usually costs between 600 and 800 euros per day. If you go to the ICU, that number increases significantly. And most of us are spending already a significant amount of our GDP on healthcare. The US stands out with 20%, but I think like if you look at Europe, it's between 10 and 12, 14% of GDP. So I think that we should be realistic and realize that we need to do more with not more money, but smarter technologies, and that's where AI really comes in. And we've been smart about how we do medicine. For instance, we in Sweden we've reduced from 6 hospital beds, I think this per 1,000 inhabitants, to 2 beds in the last 30 years, and this is not unique for Sweden. Everyone has been doing this, and I think this is just pure economics. It's very expensive to have people in hospitals nowadays, and the less you need to, the better. And we need to continue with this progress. And I think by optimizing the regular workflow, we're kind of at a where do we go next? How do we push this beyond where we are? So as I said, I did my PhD defense in 2014. I decided then that registry studies were not that exciting in my mind. They had limited applications, and I switched to artificial intelligence. And my background in programming, coding, is that I've been coding since '95. So I had 20 years back then, now 30 years of coding behind me. So really fit well with my technological background. So 2014, we started the whole project. We got the ethical application. We want to look at fractures, and we downloaded the entire Danderyd hospital data on plain radiographs, anonymized them, and started training AI. And this was like, just to understand what do you mean by downloading? Well, basically it took us half a year just to download the amount of data, because back then we had to have our own server. We had to download pieces, anonymize them, and then transport them off to a larger storage unit, and was incredibly time consuming. And the first AI trials, this was very early on in the AI, we sent off to KTH, the Royal Technological Institute here, and they came back like, this doesn't work. This we maybe should try something else than AI for this radiograph problem. It just doesn't learn what it should learn. But then that's the benefit of being within the medical field, is you know how much noise it is in the medicine, that the signal and the noise is very mixed up. So we started cleaning up the data, and a couple of years later we published this first paper on AI for orthopedic trauma, and it was incredibly successful in how many times it was cited, but it wasn't kind of where I wanted to go. So I quickly realized that I really want to try to do a clinical application, see if this works as intended. And we started out with the cleaning, that we realized we need to have a software for cleaning the data to annotate it properly. And that's where I realized we could just use this same software with some modifications in a clinical pilot. And it turned out that at the hospital we had a innovation unit that knew exactly how to deal with the regulatory parts, and then we just set it up and had it up and running for a couple of years, which was really interesting, but also realized that it's some of the problems are hard, some of the problems are easy. And when my former PhD student came back from Harvard, he said that everyone there is starting labs. So that's when we started the clinical AI research lab, which was the reason I became AI Suite of the Year. So the CAIR-Lab is basically like my take-home message was that it's actually easier to do this than but if you have a good idea, you know the solution, you need to know the how do you do this? How do you take an idea, research idea, from just a paper to something that can be used in a bedside clinical practice? So the whole idea behind CAIR-Lab is that we take any idea with advanced algorithms, ideally AI solutions, and then we try to focus on actual clinical implementation. And since we started this, it was incredibly successful. So we now have several different projects. We still do orthopedics and radiographs, but we also have cardiology, we have some internal medicine, we have LLMs, we have gynecology, all of these different fields that have the same goals. So it's been really interesting, and we're slowly making progress. But it's also, we've learned a lot along the problem path of innovation and clinical AI applications, that quite often we are focusing on the wrong problem. Like the first paper we had was, can we find a fracture? Yes or no? But that's really not the type of problem that is clinically that relevant for an orthopedic surgeon. It's more like, so there's this type of fracture, what kind of evidence do we have to support surgery or conservative treatment? And the problem is usually we underestimate the problem, the size of it. So it's much wider than expected. And also finance is incredibly hard for AI. There's a lot of money in AI, but it kind of goes towards the private sector. When you're in academia, you're stuck between you don't do traditional medical research and you don't do technological innovating research. You try to implement the technology, and it's really hard to convince the usual funding bodies for that part. So it's really challenging for each projects that we've had. But the idea is that we want to teach implementation, help people learn to implement technology in the healthcare sector, learn about the medical device regulatory framework and the AI Act and all of that, and to try and just, if it doesn't work, fail, try again, fail, try again until it works. If you do it in a controlled fashion, it doesn't need to be that dangerous. But you need to have the control mechanism in place. Also, one thing that you need to start thinking about is the financing and the reimbursement models, and we're trying to convince regulatory bodies that reimbursement per unit is great, but it's really not that it doesn't really push innovation in this field. So what you would really like to see is like reimbursements for quality. How many patients do get readmitted? How many patients are able to work after they've been treated, et cetera, and of course mortality should be included in these reimbursements, because that kind of widens the spectrum what you can do, because there's so many predictive models out there that can help you do the right thing. But you also need to have the right reimbursements in place for that to work in a hospital settings. Otherwise, you won't get anywhere. Just one thing we did early on was we started a company. So this is our pitch deck back from way back. I think we started in 2016. So this was an interesting. We had this software we tested here, and then we tried to pitch this to investors, and how do we get this from the research into an actual CE marked implementation. We had this kind of like stepwise where we could do more and more complex things. I think now much of this is we're at the second level here, where you can do those, but we're still not really utilizing AI to the full potential. The interesting part was that this was completely dead in the eyes of investors. So here's the financials behind this, which is why AI is so hard to sell to investors. So basically, radiologists get 80 Swedish kronor per exam when they review it, so they can review quite a few in a short amount of time. The quality isn't always that great, but it gets done. And roughly you can see that each year there's about 2 million orthopedics exams. So if we would include every single one of them with procurement and everything, we would have a market about 80 million. Now, when that's great, but then if you look at the CE marking cost and the development cost, you see that very quickly this doesn't make meet ends, because you have at least 2-3 million for the CE marking. If you have the CE marking for these type of products is class 2, which means you have to have a notified body. And if you have a notified body, they charge 20,000 per hour, from what I've heard. So it's really expensive to do this. And then there was also like you have to get the product up and running. So in total, it was very interesting. What we learned is that venture capital in Sweden is really tiny. It's great if you have a good kind of already paved way, but when you're walking on uncharted waters, there's much higher uncertainty. And whenever we pitched it, we quickly got back that, well, yes, great, come back with when you have the CE marking. And that was kind of like an impossible task for us to finance a CE marking for a couple of million, and also a couple of million for development. So it was really hard, and also clear that the evidence and the company value are not always the same. So as a researcher, I'm mostly interested in building evidence, but that's not always what builds the market value. And of course, we in our group had a problem that none of us were 20 years old and were able to commit at that percentage that the young people at the time we were in the Sting incubator. They could commit much more time, of course, than we were able. But it was very interesting, and I think what we part of this we took home into CAIR-Lab and realized that yes, if we're gonna make AI happen in healthcare, we need to help companies to get closer to the CE marking so that the venture capital can step in and take over, because where we were was too far away. It wasn't possible to do that. And by having all these different projects, we can easily share the knowledge and help each other, because most of these products, I mean, gynecology is not competing with orthopedic radiography or cardiology. All of these parts are different, but we can help each other and perhaps overcome part of the tiny Sweden problem. So now I'm going to talk a little about our projects and what we have, kind of a small spectrum. One of these is the pre-CAIR ML project. It's an EU-financed project where we have chart data and we predict risk of a major cardiac event within 5 years. They've had this up and running in Austria, and they contacted us and said that we want to develop this algorithm further. We want to implement it in Sweden or multiple countries, but Sweden was one of them, and try to see if we can get people to act before they get a cardiac event. That's the general idea. And it's kind of been amazing. We were the first ones to get the ethical approval for this. And here in Sweden, it's fairly easy to get ethical approval for getting data without consent. Now, we still struggle getting the data. So we're 4 years into the project. We have parts of the data was delivered in the autumn, but the major part, the real chart prediction data, we're still waiting for. What we kind of did to ourselves, which was probably a bad idea, we did a very complex data extraction to minimize the number of charts we would need. But that also, I think, hinder the data extraction. They don't know how to do this, and there's multiple sources for data. Ideally, like when we had the images, we could go for one source and just export everything from that source, much easier. But working with multiple sources, and there's a real lack of people that know how to export these things from our data sets. All the data is available. We have the data we want is in databases out there. So if you would put me in to do this, it would probably take 1 to 5 days, depending on how familiar I am with this data. But it's been 4 years now, really frustrating. And another project we have is we do with the gynecologists, obstetrics here. We have a lot of childbirths in Danderyd. And here we include all hospitals in Stockholm. We got all the approvals from everyone after the ethical approval. So it took a while. It wasn't that complex. Then we got the major company that does the CTG surveillance on board. But then the data extraction kind of, like, we've been working with the data extraction for 2 years now, really challenging. And also financing has been challenging here, even though it's a very interesting project with a lot of potential. The first application failed, and we finally got it for the second funding application. But really, kind of mind blowing how you have this wide collaborations and you write these, and just how hard should it be to get data and start working on the AI. We have people that can work on the AI, but the data extraction is so incredibly time consuming. And I think here, when you want to do these things, one of the superpowers we have is that I can always write the code myself and do the extraction. So usually that's seems to be the way everything ends up, that uh, going to people asking for the data is never really working. It works when I do the extraction myself. Kind of frustrating, but that's one thing we've learned. Next thing we work with, which is I'm really excited about, of course, as everyone. I think this is the main AI hype, is the large language models. So we all hope that we will be more productive. We have better job satisfaction. We can focus on the fun tasks. And we showed early on, like we were discussing what should we do, and like wise from the data extraction, I said, okay, well, let's try not to do real data at start. Let's just fake some data and see how it works. And we show that it actually works surprisingly well for writing discharge summaries and discharge letters for orthopedic cases. Then I think it's when you have these large language models, you have to be really careful with them. And then here's where you have great power, but of course great responsibility. There's this amazing case from Air Canada where they put a chatbot that recommended a reimbursement strategy that they didn't have, and they lost the case. So that kind of like is interesting, both that of course the judges said that if the bot recommends something, that's that should be valid. But it's also amazing that companies dare to do this, that you should be aware that these large language models are chaotic. What we gained the ability to have these tools, but also in the process we lost the ability to have them predictive. So in terms of how they will change their behavior slightly each time. So what we've done since then is basically we built up a site for expanding the data set for the charts. So we've taken the orthopedic charts, and then we've added cardiology, medicine, orthopedics. We have urology, we have surgery, we have Swedish, Danish, German. Now we also have some Norwegian translations. So it's all there's one source of truth, and then you have multiple translations into multiple languages, both small. We have Icelandic, for instance, so it's really small languages. We have German, we have French, and of course English. We're working on hospital English right now, getting translated these source English charts to hospital English. So a really interesting data set that this is how it looks when you evaluate. So you have this a chart. It looks more or less like you expect. It has medications, lab values, and then the notes, and then there's a summary, and you get to evaluate in a standard fashion how this looks. And what we saw in this first, where we only used English and Swedish, and we used internal medicine and orthopedics, because that's where we had the most complete data. And it was, this was ChatGPT 4, so it's slightly old by now. But it was interesting because we realized that it makes really good summaries. It does the job really well. They're very easy to read. But it has these super weird failure modes. So, for instance, esomeprazole and Nexium are the same drug. Every doctor in Sweden knows this, that they're the same, but the LLM wrote them on as separate medications. So they kind of gives a hint that the LLM is not that great at really understanding. It's good at mimicking what is seen before. And we could also see that the more complex, more hospital notes, and especially if you go into Swedish, the worse the LLM performs. So it's good when it's in an area where it's familiar, where there's lots of training data for it. But when you look at the hospital setting, it's completely different. So you would have really weird recommendation like fasting after discharge, which is why that's kind of odd. And then sometimes it was like reasonable but wrong. Someone was married, but there was no note of them being married in charts. So kind of these things will become an issue as we start implementing this technology in our daily lives. And I think what's also good to remember is that this is how large the data set is and how we've been training and how much data it is there. So we're kind of reaching the top performance, and you see that in the changes between GPT-4, GPT-4o, GPT 4.5. I really have a hard time saying which one is better than the other one. They're slightly different, but it's hard to know if there's a big change. So I think evaluating new ways of doing this is incredibly important. And I think one of the parts where we can very early on start working with LLMs, where you don't have any problem with these when it hallucinates that someone is married or gives slightly weird recommendations, is that you can easily find, if you're doing a registry study or doing large studies, you can scan a lot of charts and get real good quality data out of there. And you can also help making sure that when you put in quality data, when you write your chart, you can easily check are all the important pieces there or not. So I think that's really one of the parts where I would start using the technology. And then also back to the beginning, I think there's been a lot of hype for AI. And during COVID, there were so many AI tools, so many applications and predictions and monitoring. None of them actually helped. We had vaccines that solved the problem for us. And I think you need to be aware that there are other solutions than AI. Sometimes AI can enhance them. I think a lot of the vaccines had advanced algorithmic support for them, but yeah, it's you can't only look at the technology. You also have to have the other solutions in place. So, thank you.